Okay, well, it is 1:01 p.m. Central Time, and welcome to the Introduction to Building Mobile Apps in Xojo. I'm Geoff Perlman. I'm founder and CEO of Xojo, and I'm here with Paul Lefevre, one of our engineers who works on our mobile framework. Javier is here as well, who also works on the mobile frameworks occasionally. So we're going to dive right into it. If you have any questions as we go through the webinar, enter them into the Q&A panel. You'll see that in your Zoom window, and we're going to answer those. Paul will be answering most of them as we go along. Some of them we'll review at the end in the Q&A session at the end. So let's talk about what we're going to cover in this webinar. We're going to be covering user interface, coding considerations, special events that are somewhat unique or different in mobile apps, notifications, device location and motion, debugging, security, deployment, and last but not least, preparing for Android. So the goal of this webinar is to basically give you a pretty good overview of what you need to do to build a mobile app in Xojo. Some of this will be specific to iOS because that's what we're shipping now, but a lot of it, in fact, I'd say most of it applies to Android as well. All right, so let's talk about the user interface. You really have to think differently when you're building a user interface for mobile. It's very different from the desktop, certainly, and that's where most of our users have experience. It's a little more like a web app, and you'll see what I mean as we go through it. So specifically, you need to think about your layout design. When you're building a desktop app, you're used to having multiple windows. The user interface can be broken out, and you can have as many windows open as you want, but that's not the case with mobile apps. With mobile apps, you typically only have a single layout on screen at any given moment. So this is the Contacts app that Apple provides running in the iOS simulator. And you probably do this without thinking, but basically when you access this app, there's a list of records of people. You tap on one, and that takes you to another layout, which is a detail layout for that list. And you don't do much editing on this layout. You can edit the notes, but that's about it. And if you want to edit, you click the edit button to go to yet another layout for editing. So there's 3 layouts involved here. And those layouts are really stacked on top of each other, much like opening web pages in a web app. For example, I tap on that first one, it brings up the second, which will be the only thing the user sees. And then if they click edit, they're now on the third. And behind the scenes, these really are kind of stacked in that if the user presses the cancel button, it's going to take them back to the detail layout in the middle. If they press iCloud, that's the back button. It's going to take them back to the list. So you have to think about your layout design in that way. And you're not going to be using labels so much. You've got limited real estate in a mobile app. Now, there is one exception to that. If you're designing for the iPad, or if you're designing for larger iPhones in landscape mode, you can manage to get two layouts or 2 screens on the layout at the same time. On the left, you've got the list, and on the right, the detail. In this case, it's the Contacts app. So there are times when you can do this, but again, that's for the larger phones and for tablets, basically. Now, when you create a new default iOS project, you've got 2 layouts, iPhone layout and iPad layout. These aren't like Windows and web pages, though. That's a screen, and we'll get to that. iPhone layout and iPad layout are for setting up the way your layouts are going to appear in on the iPhone or the iPad. For example, if I select the app class in the navigator, you see over on the right is the inspector, or portion of the inspector, and there's a default iPhone layout and a default iPad layout. Now, if you don't want to support one of these, like let's say I was building an app that's only for iPhone, then I can switch the default iPad layout to none, in which case the app will only support the iPhone. Or to put it a different way, If the user launches the app on the iPad, they'll see the iPhone version of it. So that's what those are for. Now, for each layout, iPhone layout, iPad layout, you need to indicate a starting screen. Screens are like windows on the desktop or web pages on the web. So you'll notice that the content property there has a pop-up menu, and you can choose any screens that are in your project. You can also choose tabs if you want to have a tabbed interface for this particular screen, or rather this layout. And let me show you what I mean by that. Tabs are those things at the bottom. You've all seen them in iPhone apps or iPad apps. Let me zoom in on that a little bit, right? So in this case, there's a layout behind the scenes that's set up to be tabbed, and each of those tabs will have its own screen. So this would be a layout and 5 screens, if that makes sense. Now, you set the screen for each tab in the inspector. You see it shows there tab 0 content, and you can pick from all the screens that are available. In this case, it's a default project, so there's just screen 1. But you can also tap on the tabs that appear at the bottom of the screen once you've selected tabs as the content. You see over there, there's the layout editor on the right. It's showing tab 0 and tab 1. Those are clickable, so you can click on one and use the inspector to set the tab. You can also click on edit in the inspector next to tabs and get to the tab editor, where you can set the label for each tab. You can add them, move them around. You can choose the icon you want for the tabs, etc. Now, for the iPad layout, you have a few more options. You've got the ability to, in addition to tabs, to split the screen. You notice that in the content pop-up menu. And when you split the screen, you end up with those 2 sections, the left-hand section, which is called main, and the right-hand section, which is called detail. And you can see in the inspector in the screen layout, there's 2 pop-up menus for now choosing which layout, or rather which screen you want on the left side and which screen you want on the right side. A great example of a split screen is the settings app. When you look at that on iPad, you see the left-hand side is the list and the right-hand side is the detail. That's a great example. Now, all you need to do here is select a screen for each via the inspector, and both the left and right screens can have tabs as well. So keep that in mind. Now, these layout project items also are where you indicate what device orientations you're going to support. So you'll see that the inspector has a section called supported orientations. All of the orientations are on by default. My recommendation to you here is to leave them on, build your app, and when you get to the point where you're starting to test it, then you can try rotating the device and see which orientations make sense and which don't. If I don't think it's necessary to support every orientation. If your user interface doesn't work very well in a particular orientation, then go ahead and turn that one off. Your users will figure out very quickly which orientations your app supports. Now let's talk about screens. I've mentioned them a few times, and like I said, they're basically the equivalent of a window in a desktop app or a web page in a web app. So they're the mobile equivalent of those, and they're where you lay out your actual controls. So in a default project, again, you've got a screen 1, which is like a window 1 or a web page 1 in desktop and web projects. But you also have a launch screen. The launch screen is something that appears right when the app is launching, just for a moment, in case your app takes a few moments or a few seconds to get up to speed. And it has some limitations as a result. You can choose a background color, you can have labels, and you can have image viewers. but that's it. So it's a very limiting screen, but it's designed to get on the user's device very quickly and disappear once your main screen is ready to go. Now, unlike controls on Windows and web pages, mobile controls use something a bit more sophisticated called constraints. They perform the same function as control locking, but they give you more options. You can see in this example in the layout editor, we've got a text field selected, and there's a part of the inspector in a mobile project called auto layout. And in there, you see a list of items. Each of those is a constraint. And again, it's like locking. You're constraining the left side, the top, the right, etc. But again, they are more sophisticated. For example, if I double click on one of those constraints, then the editor changes so that I can edit the individual constraint. And there's a lot of stuff going on in these. You can set the left edge or right edge, whatever, top, bottom, equal to a particular part of another control. In this case, it's the parent control, so that's the screen itself, but it could be relative to another text field or a button or a table, whatever. The other thing you want to note about this is an offset. The offset property creates a gap between the control and either the edge of the screen or the space between the control and another control. That's what that is for. It defaults to standard. You can change it, but usually you'll want to leave it on standard because the OS will then manage that amount of space. Now, I could do an entire webinar just on constraints. So there's a lot going on there, but what you'll find is that you can drag the controls around the layout and these constraints will update automatically, especially when you're dragging them and dropping them where the guidelines appear in the layout editor. You'll notice on the left there's the top says top layout guide. That's what it means. It's not bound to the top of the screen, but the layout guide itself. So the best thing to do here is just to experiment with these, and you'll figure it out, and you'll get them just the way you want to. Also, you can create these constraints at runtime in code. There's an iOS layout constraint class you can look at if you need to do that. Now, because there's limited space, labels rather for fields should be done differently for mobile layouts. Often the content makes it clear enough, especially since there's usually a separate layout for editing. In the case of the Contacts app, only the Notes field has a label. The word work in the phone and address fields is not a label, it's actually another field. So when the user goes to edit, then you use the hint property to indicate what kind of data goes into that field, because again, space is very, very limited. So you're not going to want to include a lot of labels the way you're used to doing in a desktop or a web application. Instead, make heavy use of the hint property so that the user knows what kind of information to enter. Also, for text fields, make sure that you're setting the input type properly. It will default to the input type property, but you want to look at the kind of data that the user is going to be entering into that text field and then set it as the input type. The reason for this is that on a mobile device, this will dictate which keyboard pops up for them to do data entry, and it'll be way faster if they get the right keyboard. For example, for a phone number field, you set it to phone, and then this is the keyboard you get rather than the big keyboard with all of the characters. Much faster for the user. And there are lots of different keyboard types, as you saw in that last list. Now, layouts that scroll. Again, space is really limited on a mobile device. So often you'll find yourself having to make a layout that needs to scroll. You can't fit it all onto the dimensions of the screen. Now, if that layout is just showing a table of rows of data, then the table control will handle that. It'll do all the scrolling for you. But there are times when that's not what you're doing. You have a whole bunch of different controls. You're using containers perhaps, And you just need the user to be able to scroll through all of those. And we've all used apps that do this kind of scrolling. And for those, you use a control called a scrollable area. This is something unique to mobile projects. So how this works is you drag one of those out onto the layout, and then you create a container control. And if you look at this the screenshot here, I've got a container control that's selected called fieldless container, and it's actually got a bunch of containers itself. There's another container called entry container, which is just a field and a button. So I dragged a bunch of those onto this layout. And then once you've got your container created, you then click on your scrollable area on your screen, and you'll notice that over in the inspector under behavior, there's a container property. And when you click that, it'll show all of the containers in your project. So you then just select that. I selected fieldless container in this case, and now the scrollable area will show that. And just so you can see this in action, I've got a little movie here that shows it running in the simulator. So you can see that I can now scroll that whole area. Yeah, so that's basically how it works when you need scroll. Now, in this case, I use a container repeated over and over, but it doesn't have to be that way. It's just a container control with a bunch of other controls in it. It doesn't have to be a list of containers. It could be anything you want, but the scrollable area is what makes that container that's embedded within it scroll. Now let's talk about navigation. Switching screens from a code point of view is really no different than on a desktop or in a web app. In this example, the overview screen has a button called Details, which opens a detail screen. Now, an important detail in this case, pardon the pun, is the back button caption. Look in the inspector and you'll see that there's a property called back button caption. And you'll notice it says overview. Well, that's because that's the caption that's going to appear on the back button of the screen you open from this screen. Okay, so for example, the code to open that screen is going to look like this, just like you do with a web page or a desktop app. I create a variable D as new, in this case, detail screen. That's the name of my screen. And then d.show. And once the detail screen comes up, it's the back button text that appeared on the overview screen that's going to show up as the back button. So again, I've got a movie here. This will show you. I'm going to go ahead and click the details button, and there's the detail screen, and you see overview. I click and it takes me back. All of that navigation between these is handled for you. There's no code involved in navigating between screens. I mean, you do have to show a screen, but going back to a previous screen, that's handled for you. Now, there's an important detail here, though, and that is that the way I wrote this, where I had that code that said var d as new detail screen, since that's a local variable, when the user clicks the back button, the variable is going to go out of scope. So the contents of that screen would then be gone, of the detail screen. So if you want to keep the contents there, maybe the user is going to be going back and forth between them, you just need to store your new screen, in this case, the detail screen. You need to store that reference somewhere else, like say in a property of the overview screen. Then when the user clicks details, you can just show the screen and see the previous version of it. Just make sure you're not creating a new screen each time. You have to basically check to see if your property is nil. If it is, create a new screen. If not, just show the existing one if you want to maintain the contents of that previous screen. All right, next, let's talk about message box. Oh, we all use message box. And we have message box built in for mobile projects as well. It's just as you'd expect. You call message box and give it a string. This is what the message box looks like on iOS. Very straightforward. We use it a lot, but we also have mobile message box. So this is something that gives you a little more control and a little more interface capabilities than the standard message box. With this, you can set a title, in this case, concerning hobbits, along with a message, and then you can have one or more buttons. If you have two buttons, they're side by side. This is at least on iOS. if you have more than they're stacked. And it's really straightforward to do this. The mobile message box is a control, so you can just drag it out from the library and drop it on your layout, or on your screen rather, and you'll get an instance at the bottom in the tray, in this case, message box 1. And then perhaps in the opening event of your mobile message box, you'd set your title, message, and buttons to show it. It's just what you'd expect, message box 1.show. And it has a pressed event, and the pressed event is passed a button index parameter. You can see that in the second line down there for pressed. And basically you just get the buttons from the buttons property, create an array, and then you can basically see which button the user pressed by looking at the button index. So that's what's causing those screens to come up and say, if I press Frodo, then I have a message box that pops up and says, you selected Frodo. So mobile message box will do a lot for you that a regular message box will not do. All right, next let's talk about some control differences. There's some pretty important differences in mobile controls compared to desktop and web controls. First of all, there are fewer events. There's less going on in that respect, so there are fewer events. There's no drag and drop. There are no key events, though the text field does have a text changed event, and it has a returned pressed event, which is an event that's unique on mobile. Instead of list boxes, you have tables, but tables are very similar to list box. They have add row, remove row, things like that. You can think of them as basically a single column list box. But they also have another class called iOS row actions. And basically you use this for swipe buttons. You've probably seen apps where you can swipe from, say, right to left, and then you get some buttons to delete a row, that kind of thing. Well, if you want that in your interface, you're going to want to look at the iOS row actions class and see how to set that up, because that's what takes care of that. Now, finally, icons. Apple provides a large list of icons that they strongly encourage you to use in your apps. And you can get to these through picture.systemimage. It's a shared function. And to see and peruse the icons that are available to you, go to the App Store and download the SF Symbols app. There's almost 4,500 different icons in here. And like I said, Apple really encourages you to use these. They're also all scalable. You can tint them with colors, etc. So you definitely want to look for your icons first in here. Next, let's talk about the sharing panel. Xojo provides access to the sharing panel. It's really easy to use. If you're not sure what I mean by that, it's the icon in apps that typically looks like this, and that icon came straight from the SF Symbols app, by the way. And on the right there, I've got an example of the sharing panel coming up in the Photos app, for example. So how do you add the sharing panel to your app? It's really, really simple. You drag the sharing control from the library. That's the sharing control on the left. Drop it on your layout, and you'll get an instance of it, just like mobile message box. You'll get an instance in the tray, in this case, sharing panel 1. And then you can share 3 types of data. First, you can share text. Very simple. You call share text, pass it the text you want to share, and up will pop the sharing panel. Now, this is, I'm showing this in the iOS simulator. So it's only showing a few apps because there aren't many apps in the simulator, but all the apps that are prepared to accept a string or accept text will appear there. The user can copy, save to files, etc. So that's sharing text. You can share URLs, and it's the same way. You call share URL, pass it the URL, and then it'll show the URL at the top. Again, it'll show apps that are prepared to accept a URL. The user can copy it, add it to a reading list, etc. And you can share pictures. So you pass it the picture, and then you'll get the same kind of deal where any apps that are designed to accept pictures will show up. And normally you'd see the application icon In this case, I'm running the simulator and the app doesn't have an icon, so it's showing the default icon in the upper left corner of the sharing panel. But that's how the sharing panel works. It's very straightforward, very, very easy to implement. All right, next let's talk about notifications. Notifications are, of course, supported for iOS. Now, in order to display notifications, you need to add the notification center to your project. You do that by going to Insert and choosing Notifications. There are two different kinds of notifications. There are local notifications. And a good example of that is like if you're using the clock app for a timer and the timer goes off, that notification that comes up is local. The whole thing happens on the device. The second kind of notification is called a remote notification. Remote notifications begin off device. In other words, they start perhaps on a server somewhere and then arrive at the device. An example of that is like if you order something from Amazon and you get a notification that it's shipped, that starts on an Amazon server and arrives at the user's device. That's a remote notification. And if you're going to do notifications, you'll want to look at the mobile notifications class. And this is another one where I could do an entire webinar just on notifications, but I'm just going to kind of skim the surface right now. And if you, I may do another one on notifications later, but this will give you an idea of what they're capable of and the basics of how to set them up. And one last thing that's tangentially related to notifications, if you have kind of application where information, is like mail, right? In mail, you have unread messages and you get a badge that indicates how many unread messages you have. The icon badge number property is where you do that. It's just a number. You just set whatever number there you want and it'll automatically badge it. Badge your application icon with that number. It's handy when you have notifications coming in and those notifications are there to represent something that the user needs to take action on. The icon badge number can be used for that. So, remote notifications. First of all, you need to provide Apple with a really good reason why you need them. And we'll get into what that means later, but you can't just add them willy-nilly. You need to have a reason that your application needs to have notifications. You'll need to have an Apple Push Services certificate, and you get this at developer.apple.com. You're going to need to sign up your app to receive notifications through Apple's developer website as well. And in Xojo, you need to enable remote notifications. And the way you do that is you go to Build Settings, click on iOS, click on the Advanced tab, and you'll see a list of things there of capabilities, and there'll be one that's push notifications. You turn that on to enable your app to receive remote notifications. Now, last but not least, you're going to need a service provider to send them. You can't necessarily send them yourself. That's a very complicated process. So let's talk about service providers. There are three considerations for a service provider. First is pricing. Now, most remote notification service providers, they'll give you some notifications for free, and that might be enough for your situation, especially if it's an internal app at your company or something like that. And then after a certain level, they start to charge you on a per notification basis. There are security concerns, though, because they need to have your Apple Push Services certificate in order to send out notifications on your behalf. And that means that anyone with that certificate could, in theory, send notifications that appear to be coming from you. So, these services are obviously designed to be secure, but this is just something that you need to be aware of, which brings me to an alternative, and that is Xojo Cloud. So with Xojo Cloud, there's no additional cost for sending remote notifications. It's built into your Xojo Cloud server. Security is not an issue because you're in control of your server. You're not handing your certificate to anybody else. And our security is really best of class. So if you're going to be doing remote notifications, one option would be Xojo Cloud. All right, let's talk about authentication. Authentication means the user providing proof that they are who you think they are. On iOS, this means Face ID or Touch ID, or even the user entering their device password or passcode. And this is going to be a familiar theme. You do this by dragging the control on the left there, the authentication control from the library, drop it onto your layout, and you'll get a user authentication instance. In this case, by default, it'll be user authentication 1. That's pretty straightforward. And then what you do is to request the authentication dialog to come up, you just simply call request on your instance, user authentication 1 in this case. You pass it a string that is the reason you want the user to know why you're asking for them to authenticate. And that second parameter, which I've set to true, indicates whether or not it's okay for the user to authenticate with their passcode or password. Sometimes you may not want them to do that. If you're being super secure, you could set that to false. Otherwise, you can set it to true. Now, if the authentication succeeds, then the authentication succeeded event will fire on your instance. Anything else happens, like it doesn't succeed, you'll get the error event. It's pretty straightforward. Now let's talk about some coding considerations. There are lots to consider when you're writing a mobile app in terms of how you code. First of all, the big one is battery life is very important. Okay, you really have to take this into account when you're designing your app. And what I mean here is, if you have time-consuming code, if you're maybe processing a lot of pictures or something, if that takes too long, the OS gets fussy and it can actually cause your app to quit. So you don't want that happening. So you really need to be cognizant of this when you're writing a mobile app. Another area you need to be thinking about is when you're connecting to outside services. When you're building a web app or you're building a desktop app, you can connect to, say, a database server, and you can leave that connection open. But you cannot do that on a mobile app. That connection will eat up a lot of battery because it's eating up a lot of CPU, and the OS will just shut your app down. So when you're making these kind of connections, they need to be quick, or they need to be asynchronous, using like a REST API, that sort of thing. So that's something to keep in mind. It's very different from building mobile apps versus desktop apps. If you're used to building database front ends, for example, you're probably going to need some kind of middleware application. You could write it as a Xojo web app, but you're going to need a middleware application that accepts the request for data asynchronously, and then the middleware can be connected not full time to your database server. So again, that's something to think about. Now, there are also some events that are either unique to mobile or just operate a little bit differently in mobile. Let's talk about the primary ones. First of all is the deactivating event. This means that your app is being sent to the background, much like the deactivating event or deactivated event in a desktop app. Just means the app is going to the background. The app is still running, but it's in the background. The opening event. Now, this event fires when your app is launched by the user or, and this one's important, relaunched by iOS. Now, the reason that's important is there are times when your app might be shut down by the operating system and then relaunched, and the user never, if you've done your work right, the user will never know that this happened. If you get a closing event, that means it could mean that the user is forced to quit the app, although I don't know if you get a closing event under those circumstances. But if iOS shuts your app down because it's running out of memory, then you're going to get a closing event. So in the closing event, what you're going to want to do, and this is very different from a typical web app or a desktop app, is you're going to want to look at the state of your app and store some data in a file so that you can recreate the state when the app opens. Because again, the user may think that the app is just going to the background when in fact the app has quit entirely. So you need to store information about the state of your app, what screen you were on, what data was available in the various fields, etc. And then in the opening event, you can restore it. What that does for the user is it makes it transparent. They don't know the app ever quit. That's the purpose of this in an iOS app. Now, another special event is low memory warning. And as you can guess, this means that iOS is running low on memory and your app is probably going to be shut down. So that's just how you know. I want to go back actually for a second to the closing event. I forgot to mention. I don't know the exact time. I want to say it's 30 seconds. It might be less, but it gives you a limited amount of time to write data to disk. So you can't take too long. Now, you shouldn't be writing a lot of data anyway, so that'll probably be fine. But if you look in our documentation, it'll indicate how long you have typically to get that job done. Okay, there's some app-based URL events. A good example would be like in the Contacts app, when you tap on an address, it takes you to the Maps app. Well, Contacts is sending an app-specific URL to the OS, which then sends it to the Maps app to be handled. So let's look at those. So first, there's handle URL. Your app has been passed to URL. It's pretty straightforward. But again, these aren't URLs like to web pages and stuff. These are app-specific URLs. And then there's handle background URL. The only difference here is that your app was in the background and not in the foreground. So handle URL, your app is in the foreground. Handle background URL, it's in the background. That's the difference. And these app-specific URLs will typically be something like, maybe the app name, a : / and then the part that follows is like a command or some command and some data, that sort of thing. But they're not, again, URLs in the web browser sense. Now, the way you set these up is you go to the navigator, click on iOS under Build Settings. You go over to the Advanced tab in the inspector, and you turn on the Custom URL Schemes capability, and then you click Options, and in there, you'll be able to set up the URL events, rather the URLs that your app can respond to in the URL events. Okay, next is shortcuts. So shortcuts, if you haven't used them before, are these menus that are attached to an application. This is the shortcut menu for the camera app that lets you do a bunch of different things, take a selfie, record video, etc. And you can do these in Xojo. And it's pretty straightforward in terms of creating and responding to shortcuts. So to implement a shortcut menu, first go to iOS under Build Settings and click on the Advanced tab in the inspector, and then turn on shortcut items, as you see here. Press the Options button, and this dialog will appear. And in the dialog, you can add shortcut items. You can indicate a type, a title, a subtitle, and you can even tell it the name of the icon you want associated with that. This is another great place to use the SF symbols icons, by the way. Definitely use them here. And then you add your shortcuts in the app.opening event, and then you respond to them in the app.handle shortcut event. And it'll pass you a parameter, so you'll know which shortcut the user chose. It's pretty straightforward. Now, for some apps, you need to know where in the world the device is. And if that's yours, you'll want to use the mobile location class. And once again, it'll be a familiar theme as to how you implement this. In the library, you use the mobile location control, drag that onto the layout. It'll appear as an instance in the tray, in this case called location 1. And it's fairly simple to use it. What you're going to want to do is at the point at which on the screen that you're using it, you'll want to, in this case, in the opening event of the mobile location instance, you'll want to check the authorization state, because you need to be authorized to use this because a user's location is private information. And there's an enumeration you can check, mobile location.authorization states.authorized app in use. If that's the case, then you have the authorization to get the location, and you can just call the start method to start receiving it. Now, the reason there's a start method is you only want to be receiving notifications of or events of mobile location when you really need them. You don't want them necessarily to be happening all the time because they do use the battery. Now, if authorization state is not authorized app in use, that means you don't have authorizations. You need to request it. And in that case, you call me.request usage authorization and pass it the app in use authorization type. This is going to ask the user as well if they want to authorize the app to know where they are. So keep that in mind. The user could deny you permission. Now, what do you get? Well, the mobile location class, your instance, has a location changed event, and it passes you a lot of information. The latitude, longitude, the accuracy of that latitude and longitude in terms of I think it's in meters, how much space there is in terms of the accuracy. And what you'll want to do when you set this up is tell it what amount of accuracy you actually need. The more accuracy you need, the more battery life the receiving of these events uses. So don't ask for more accuracy than you need. You'll also get altitude, altitude accuracy, course, and speed. Basically everything you need to know about where the device is. But again, keep in mind, you need to check, your code should be checking for an exception because you may not have, or checking the authorization state rather, because you may not have authorization. Either Apple didn't provide it to you when you asked for it, when you originally submit your app to them, or they provided you with the ability to get it, but the user denied it when they were asked whether or not your app should have access to their location. I'm sure you've all seen that dialogue appear in apps on iOS. Now, you can test this in the simulator. In the simulator, just go to features, go down to location, and you can create a custom location, but they've got a couple of example movements as well in there. So you can see how your app would respond. So it's an easy one to test right in the simulator. Now, what if you need to know whether or not the device is moving? This is different than location. This is the device actually being in motion. In that case, you're going to use the mobile motion class. The mobile motion class provides you with pitch, roll, yaw, rotation, gravity acceleration on all three axes, and user acceleration. And basically, user acceleration is different from gravity in that user acceleration is more for things like the user flicking their wrist. Like, you've probably learned that you can shake, in a lot of apps, you can shake the phone to undo. Well, that's user acceleration. They're using mobile motion and accessing user acceleration in that case. Now, unlike location, there's no need for permission here because motion's not there's no privacy issue there. But there are start and stop methods. So you don't want to get this information when you don't need it, because again, it uses the battery. So call start when you need it, call stop when you're done. Now, mobile motion is one of those things that you cannot test in the iOS simulator. It does not simulate motion, but Xojo does support on-device debugging. So you can test this in the debugger by just connecting your device straight to your computer. And speaking of debugging, let's talk about that. Now, mostly debugging mobile apps is pretty much the same as debugging a desktop or a web app. But you have two choices. You can debug on the device itself or in the iOS simulator. Now, to do it on the device, you first need to register your device with Apple. And the easiest way to do that is through Xcode. That's a bit of a process, so you'll want to see our documentation for details on how to do that. Once you've done that, you can go to the project menu and choose Run On. And at the top, you'll see your devices. You can debug via USB with a plugged in or via Wi-Fi, and it will indicate in which way you're connected. In this case, you see that my iPad and iPhone are connected via USB. And then below that, you'll see the list of simulators. Now, that list is provided by Xcode because, of course, you need to have Xcode installed. I actually should have said that way back in the beginning. You'll need to have Xcode installed on your Mac to do any kind of any kind of mobile development, specifically iOS development. You won't have to use Xcode. You install it, you launch it, and then pretty much you're not going to have to use it again. But the simulators are provided by Xcode. So that list you see there is coming straight from Xcode. So you pick the kind of device that you want to debug to, and then you hit run or choose it and it'll run. But Xojo will remember which one you chose, so you don't have to keep going back to this menu every time. That menu may change from time to time as versions of Xcode change. So older devices may disappear, new ones show up, that sort of thing. Other than that, debugging is pretty straightforward. It's a little bit of a pain to get your devices set up initially because, again, you have to go through Xcode and all that. But once you get them set up, they're there and it's very straightforward. Okay, let's talk about security. Now, your app's access to the file system is limited to 4 folders that are associated with your specific app. Those are application support, caches, documents, and temporary. Basically, you use them the same way you would on the desktop. There's nothing particularly special about them, but these are the only things you have access to. You cannot access files from other applications. It's all just these themselves. And that leads me to entitlements. Several times I've mentioned that iOS, in order to gain access to certain things, requires that you get Apple's permission. And this comes in the form of something called an entitlement. Now, you don't need this for testing your app, for building and testing, but you will need it to deploy, even to deploy it to beta testers. Okay, so it's a lot of extra trouble to set up these, but it's really worth it. Any information basically about the user is going to be private by default, so you'll need an entitlement for that. So to access things like their contacts and etc., those are the things that you need to give Apple a really good reason, and you do this when you submit your app to them for submission to the App Store. Now, don't ask for anything you don't absolutely need, because you don't want to give Apple a reason to reject your app. Again, things like contacts, photos, the camera, the user's location, things like that, where it's in any way connected with the user, fall into this category where you need an entitlement. Now, assuming that they accept your reason for needing it, and basically you just need to explain why your app needs access to this stuff. As long as you do that, you'll be granted an entitlement. And in Xojo, everything listed, if you go to Build Settings, iOS, Advanced tab, Capabilities, all those items that have a switch control in the inspector, those capabilities, those all require an entitlement. And just remember that even if you get the entitlement from Apple, in some cases, the user can refuse to grant you permission. A great example is access to the camera, for example. Next, let's talk about deployment. So you finished building your app and now you want to deploy it. Perhaps at first you want to deploy it to beta testers and then later via the App Store. So what's involved in doing that? Well, Apple requires that they know who the creator of the app is for any app in the App Store. So that means you've got to sign your app. This requires a properly configured certificate, app identifier, and provisioning profile. Check our documentation for details. We provide you with everything you need to know to set that up with Apple. I want to emphasize, this is stuff that Apple requires. It's not anything that we require. Once you have these set up, Xojo will then sign your app when you build it. And you can see that here, your certificate will show up under Team. You just select it there. If you have several, if you're a consultant and you're building apps for multiple people, you'll probably have a certificate for each company you're doing work for. So those will all show up there. Now, if you're going to beta test, you'll probably want to use Apple's Test Flight service. This allows you to distribute apps over the air to many beta testers. It's a lot easier than trying to install them on individual phones. If it's just you or you and another person that are going to beta test, it might be worth, especially if they're in your office, it might be worth not bothering with Test Flight. But if you're going to have a group of beta testers, you'll definitely want to use Test Flight. Test Flight also has an app that the beta tester installs on their phone. and then you can configure them as a beta tester remotely, and then they'll be notified when there's a new version of your app, and it just automatically downloads and installs it, and they can use it. And it provides some instructions on giving feedback and that sort of thing. I've beta tested a couple of commercial apps, and TestFlight makes it really, really easy. Now, once you're done with beta testing, you submit your app to the App Store. This is the point at which Apple will review your app and either grant or not grant entitlements, and either agree to publish your app or tell you what you need to change first before they will. So I highly recommend that you plan ahead for this. Apple can take a day to get back to you, or they can take a couple of weeks. So you really need to build in some time, especially if you've never done this before and you don't know the kinds of things they tend to reject. It may be they just want you to make a small change. They may not grant you a certain entitlement, which means you may need to take some code out of your app, that sort of thing. But the time it takes them to respond can vary. They've gotten a lot better about it in the last several years. So that's a good thing, but definitely build in some time. You don't want to be submitting your app a day or two before you want it to be deployed, because chances are it won't happen that quickly. Now, last but not least, I want to talk about preparing for Android. Let's talk about what that's going to involve. So Android support is coming in 2023 R2. That's our next release. We support Android 8 or higher. If you're not really sure what version's the latest version of Android, I believe Android 12 is the current shipping version. So we go back, was that 4 versions? So that should be that. We cover, I think, more than 80% of the Android devices out there. It might be like 90%. So it's plenty. Now, the way you build an Android app is pretty much the same way as you build an iOS app. There are screens, you go from one screen to the next. There's navigation. The controls are very similar. The basic way you do it is pretty much the same, but it will be a separate project type, at least initially. So you'll have your iOS project and your Android project. The API is nearly identical. So for things like showing a screen, for accessing controls, that sort of thing, it's pretty much the same API. The initial release will not be as feature complete as iOS. It's not going to have a few things like notifications and authentication and a few others, but these things will be coming in updates. But the initial release will not have those. So just be aware of that. And unlike iOS, for Android, we're using control locking rather than constraints. I find that control locking is way, way easier. Constraints are very powerful, but very complex. Control locking is, well, you've all used control locking. If you've built a Xojo app, so you know it's much nicer and simpler in that respect. And if you need something if you need some special behavior that control locking doesn't do, you already know how to do that. You know you can move controls via code, and you've probably done it before in your web apps and your desktop apps. So same thing holds true for Android. And if you're going to be building an Android version of an iOS app, or if you're going to start with Android and later build iOS, make sure you're putting all of your logic in the classes so that you can easily share that logic between your Android project and your iOS project. You really want the project to mostly be the UI stuff and have as much logic as possible in separate classes that are easy to share between the two. Okay, so questions. I'm going to bring up the Q&A here, and it looks like we have...
Geoff, if I can just jump in for 1 second. There was one question that got cleared that I wanted to bring up first.
Okay, go ahead, Paul.
Let me just find it here. All right, so the question was, going back to when you were talking about scrollable area versus mobile table, when it might make sense to use one over the other. And because both of those scroll, obviously, right? You can scroll a table, you can scroll a scrollable area. And Edwin had asked the question, and he gave a really good example of one where he used a table, I think. And the important thing to keep in mind is that a table essentially gives you a list of scrollable things, and you can control what's in essentially each row of the list. And you can have, different custom cells in there and whatnot. So it's very, very flexible. But if you really don't need a list of things, say it's just a large detail area, so like the context detail, but you just had a lot of stuff, you might just rather have that all laid out and then use a scrollable area so you can scroll up and down to get to the details. So it's really more of a design decision for your app, but both options can be handy.
Yeah, that's great. I didn't mention customizing cells, but yes, the table control in iOS gives you a lot of capability for customizing cells. So if you're right, if it's just a list type of mechanism, the iOS table is probably the way to go, but otherwise use a scrollable area. Good call. Okay, so I'm going to go through some that we've answered, that Paul's been answering. I'm going to just review them here. So one user was asking if we can have auto layout for the desktop. We're not planning on bringing auto layout to the desktop. In fact, we're kind of going the opposite direction. We're implementing locking of course, for Android, and eventually we're going to bring locking to iOS. Even Apple has figured out that auto layout is really too complicated. They're adding locking type of capabilities for Swift. So,
and to jump in, Geoff, I don't know if you realize those are the answered ones I did already answer. So make sure you check the open ones too. I haven't.
Yes. Okay. Well, let me start with the open ones, then I'll go back to those. All right. So Alvaro is asking, would you be able to copy and paste from an iOS project to an Android project? Yes and no. You can certainly copy and paste code. You cannot copy and paste controls. We may support that at some point, but we don't support that right now.
And it kind of works right now, but we don't have that all completely fine-tuned yet. But
right.
It does. You can grab like a mobile button from an iOS project and paste it into an Android project, and you will get your mobile button, but you might need to tweak a few things.
Okay. Paul, I haven't tried this actually. Does it bring over code too? Because
well, let me answer another question while I try.
Okay, you go check that out. Okay. Edwin's asking, for Android, it'd be nice to have a property on the location control that exposes the raw data. Is that worth a feature request? I think you're asking about the GPS coordinates, and I believe it does provide that, if that's what you mean. But look at that and see. I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about. If it's not there, then sure, make a feature request. Scott's asking, are there any tips for creating multi-platform apps, iPhone and Android in Xojo? How to design an app for reuse as much code as possible? Yeah, so the biggest tip I can give you right now is try to make as much use of modules and classes as you can. Put as much logic as possible into those. I know you're used to putting a lot of logic into events and things like that, but the more that you can put into classes and modules and then call it from the events, the better.
All right, and I can jump in with a couple of comments, Geoff. Let's see, going back to the copy paste thing, on a control, if you do copy paste a control from iOS to Android, yes, event code is brought over.
Oh, that's great. Okay, I didn't know we'd implemented that. That's fantastic.
Well, we kind of got that for free. I wouldn't say it's implemented yet. That's why I said there's still a few tweaks we might want to do to make that work a little better, but it mostly is working.
Okay, so your mileage may vary.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's certainly it's handier than it not working, right?
Absolutely.
And Scott's question about tips for creating multi-platform apps. I'm glad you asked that, and I didn't prompt Scott, but if you do go to our YouTube channel, that is exactly the session I did at XDC back in London in May. So you can find my session on that, and I talk about how you can start to organize your apps to make better use of them across multiple platforms. So check that out.
Cool. Okay. So Tim is just making a comment. It's a very informative webinar, and he's commenting that our iOS support's come a long way over the years. He's really impressed. Thanks. Appreciate that, Tim. Okay, so let me get to some other questions here. Art's asking, how will the scale constraint be implemented when mobile changes to control locking? And Paul answered this. Future design decisions on that haven't been made yet, but expect constraints and locking to be separate things. And of course, again, like I said earlier, you can always move controls in code. So you can implement your own custom stuff for managing control location if you need to. Edwin's asking, when is the scrollable area preferred? Well, we kind of talked about this, about using custom cells. So I'm going to skip that question because I feel like we've really kind of answered it. When to use a
that was
scrollable area
the one
versus
I was
custom
bringing up, but yeah.
Okay. Edwin's asking, can I force stacked buttons on a mobile message box even if there are only 2? No, you cannot do that. That's all built into iOS. We don't even have any control over that. So Edwin's asking, so I can't share a file like a PDF document or some binary document using mobile sharing panel. Paul says, I believe a file URL will work for that. So I don't know if, Paul, do we have an example? Do you know if we have an example project that shows sharing a file? If we don't, that'd be a good one to have.
I don't know offhand.
Okay. Well, Edwin, look at using a file URL, because that may do the job for you. And if there isn't an example of that, please submit a feature request and we'll get an example made. David's asking, is there a class or something that allows me to control the layout when the app is working under iPad split view multitasking? And Paul says there's no built-in way to control that at this time. Good feature request, though. All right. Oh, and somebody has provided an example to Edwin about sharing files. So if you look in the Q&A panel, it basically shows you how to use a file URL. That makes it really simple. It's one line. It's really great. Thank you so much. Okay, Edwin's asking if you can create shortcuts dynamically. Yeah, well, you create them using add shortcut item and then handle shortcut item as the event, as I mentioned earlier. And there's information in the documentation. If you search for mobile application, add shortcut, you'll see it there. Okay, so Edwin's asking about mobile location. He's saying Apple does not provide the raw GPS data. There is a handle property for mobile location, so you might be able to do it with declares. But if Apple's not providing the data, obviously the data won't be there for you to get.
And there's a couple more open questions too, Geoff.
Yeah, I'll go back to, I'm just going down to the bottom here. I think we've got all those. Okay, let's go back. Is there declare support for Android? I believe we do have declare support for Android. So we'll have some examples, but yes, that will be supported in the initial
there is
release.
Declared support for Android. The formatting of the declares is slightly different than some of the other platforms due to the way Android works, but there is declare support for Android.
Correct. Okay. Philippe is asking whether or not he's going to be able to compile and install a simple working app which does not require any user info on iPhone without going through Apple. Yes, you can build your app and test it without, yourself, without dealing with Apple at all. The only time that you need to deal with Apple is when you want to deploy it to beta testers through TestFlight or for the App Store. At that point, Apple has to give you permission because it's their app store, and they're going to look at the app, and if there's things they don't like, they're going to give you feedback. They also have to grant you entitlements should you need them. Now, if you don't need to use motion, well, not motion, but location and the camera and things like that, well, then you won't need any entitlements. Now, that doesn't mean they won't give you feedback on your app. So you just need to be prepared for Apple to ask you to make changes before they deploy it to the App Store. Alvaro is asking roughly when would R2 be out in the public? We will be starting beta testing extremely soon, and we're aiming for late July. We'll have to see. That's just a target, but that gives you a rough idea. Mid to late summer basically is when we're aiming for that.
And just to touch on that question about the needing the Apple stuff in order to distribute your apps. Bonus point to Android, you can distribute your own apps directly. You don't have to go through Google or the Google Play Store.
Yes. And we will be doing a webinar on Android after Android ships. So we'll have one to cover all the Android specific stuff. Okay. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. Paul, do you have anything you want to add?
No. As Geoff said, we will be starting testing for 2023 R2 very soon. Very soon. I can smell it. It's so close. And, and when that happens, please, start testing all the cool stuff that'll be in that release. And in the meantime, thanks for being here. And thank you, Geoff. Great session.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And thanks to Javier as well. Javier answered some questions in the Q&A panel. We're really looking forward to this. Just so you guys know, if you haven't noticed, we've been doing Android testing for quite a long time. And so I think it's going to be in pretty good shape. I'm sure there will still be some bugs you guys will find during beta testing, and we will get those fixed, but it's going to be in pretty good shape from day one. So I want to thank everybody for attending, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar. And until next time, keep developing apps with Xojo. Have a good day. Bye-bye.